welcome, Mark. Thank you. I always get a bit worried when people introduce me and things. Like, does anyone remember my column in Good Weekend? Anybody read it? So I used to have this weekly column at the back of the paper where I used to talk about my life. And one day my mum, who lives in England, rang me up and she said, Wikipedia, I've just read your Wikipedia entry. I didn't even know I had a Wikipedia entry. And it's calling me a slut. And I'm going, what? Mum? Mum would never even use that word. And it said in my Wikipedia entry that my mum had left my dad for the lodger when I was 10 years old, which is something that actually did happen. You know, she actually lived with the guy who I still think is the lodger for the rest of her life. You know, but he was at the time an 18-year-old student, and she was his 37-year-old landlady. So somebody had put up on Wikipedia. No, I hadn't done it. So I put in my column in Good Weekend that in order to, because I said to my mum, don't worry about it, everything on Wikipedia is rubbish. So nobody believes any of it. So in my column in Good Weekend, I asked people to vandalise my Wikipedia entry. So I said, just put any rubbish in there, and then my mum will read it and realise that nobody believes it. So people, my readers, kind of reacted with some enthusiasm to this proposal. And initially they were giving me sporting titles. So my Wikipedia entry for a while had me as British slingshot champion. They tended to be kind of minority sports that no one could check up on. But then they built on my biography. I got expelled from the UK because of killing wildlife, with native wildlife, with my slingshot. And then I said, no, give me some movie roles. So the height of my movie career was they made me the dwarf inside R2-D2 in the original Star Wars. But I had all these other movie roles as well that I could point to my mum about Wikipedia being rubbish. But the actual high point, possibly the high point of my life, but certainly the high point of my Wikipedia entry, was when for 2 days I was Australia's first female Prime Minister. It took Wikipedia 2 days to take that down. But they closed my entry, they banned people from changing it. You can read all the chat behind the, I don't know what it's called, the chat behind it, as people get madder and madder about other people changing my entry. So I thought it was good fun, and it sort of, I don't know if it ever did convince my mum. But what I didn't realise was quite often when people introduce you at events, they look at your Wikipedia entry. So people could say absolutely anything, you know. And I've now introduced Australia's first female Prime Minister. But the last time it was changed, I looked at long after the competition had finished. People still go in sometimes and change it, including our own son, I believe, on one occasion. The last time I looked at it, instead of being born in 1963, I was born in 1635. And instead of being born, I was hatched. So that was quite a good intro, John. Thanks for that. I wasn't hatched, I wasn't Prime Minister. The female Prime Minister wasn't anything. So I'll talk a little bit about how I came to write the book and be a military historian, I suppose. Initially, I got interested in this topic when I was a backpacker. So I left England when I was 25 years old and came to Australia through Kanchanaburi, which is the site in Thailand, which is the site of the bridge over the River Kwai. And I'd seen the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai when I was a kid. And yeah, I loved it. It was a great film, really stuck in my mind. And in Kanchanaburi, every little guest house plays that movie over and over again. But the bridge in Kanchanaburi is not, the bridge that people come to see, is not the original bridge over the River Kwai. They just built another bridge because tourists wanted to see it. And the river that runs through Kanchanaburi wasn't the Kwai. So the tourists wanted to come and see the bridge over the River Kwai, so they renamed the river. So now the new bridge that they built, that wasn't the right bridge, was over a river that wasn't the right river. But it was a bridge over what was now the River Kwai, so tourists could come and look at it. And none of which I understood at the time. I thought I was going through the real thing. And there was a museum there. And in the museum, it told this terrible story about prisoners' life on the railway, and how this appalling tragedy where there's hundreds of prisoners on a bridge and they get machine gunned by Allied planes, and the blood in the River Kwai, not the actual river there, the actual River Kwai, ran thick with their blood. And I thought, oh, this is terrible, it's a horrible story, why doesn't anyone know about it? And of course people don't know about it because it didn't happen. The museum was full of nonsense. And they have bodies, skeletons dressed up in rags of Allied uniform in cases, which was tasteless within itself, but in cases on the display floor. And they were the bodies of coolies, as they call them, Indian, Asian labourers who worked the railway. They dug them up and stuck bits of Allied uniform on them. So that kind of, when I went back for a story about, once I realised that this is what has happened, that there was a kind of fraudulent bridge over the River Kwai racket going on, I was working for a good weekend. I went back there to Kanchanaburi, and I met the guy who runs the Thai Burma Railway Centre. And he's an Aussie guy who came there as an engineer and stayed and developed this huge database of prisoners on the railway. And he said that most people's relatives who are prisoners on the railway don't really know what they did, don't really know where they were. And he's created this massive, it was a card index back in the day, I think, I'm sure now it's a sprawling computer program, which had the actual details of everybody's imprisonment, which camps they were in, to some degree, what punishments they may have got or not got. And at the time it was held that more than 60 people were beaten to death in 60 men, Australian soldiers were beaten to death at Hellfire Pass. He said in fact one person was ever beaten to death at Hellfire Pass. There was such a massive range of misconceptions about what happened on the railway, which isn't to say it wasn't absolutely appalling, disgusting, and that the men didn't die, but they rarely died in the way that people thought they did. And quite often, sometimes people even believed that their own relatives were on the railway when they weren't. Sometimes people believed that sometimes people just stayed in Changi. And a lot of people, in part because of the John Doyle TV show, Changi, the kind of comedy, and also because sort of received wisdom, I suppose, believed that Changi was some kind of a hell camp, that it was like a concentration camp, and that these photographs of living skeletons that you see became skeletal in Changi, when of course they didn't. Changi for most of the war until 1944 perhaps, it was a horrible place because it's a prison camp. It's quite a nice prison camp, and it was administered by the Australians. The Australians did security in the camp. The people that starved, the people that ended up looking like concentration camp victims, had starved on the railway. So he was trying to, at the extent to which fiction and fact kind of merged, I think it's shown in Kanchanaburi, where you could buy pictures of prisoners, pictures of time on the railway in market stalls, and they're actually stills from bridge over the River Kwai. Like, there's just no difference at all between media and memory there. So that's kind of what got me interested in the idea of, I was more interested in misconception than misunderstanding. And the editor of Good Weekend, at the time I wrote that story, became the one of the top people at the ABC. So she went to Radio National. I did a show for Radio National about myths of war, talking about, I did an episode about the River Railway in Changi, a couple of episodes about Vietnam, episode about Gallipoli, and an episode about gays in military. And like that was, there was talk back in the days of, you know, when Bruce Ruxton was running the RSL, yeah, that, you know, there were no pufters, in the military. When I was there, I can smell them. I think he actually said he could smell gay people. And like, I don't care whether gay people are in the army or not. I'm not trying to make that kind of a point. But what I was trying to do when I did the radio episode about how there have always been gay men and women, I suppose, who served, was one guy who had served in Vietnam in the Air Force, which I had no idea, but traditionally has had a fairly large number of gay men in its ranks. One guy who'd served in the Air Force said that he had to serve in the closet, as it were. They couldn't tell anyone he was gay, and he got raped while he was in Vietnam by some American servicemen. And because there were no gays allowed in the military, he couldn't explain that he thought he was on a gay date and he got raped and stuff. And for that reason, if no other, it's important to acknowledge that, like, if you don't acknowledge them, terrible things can happen to them and they can have terrible consequences. So I did a little bit about that, and I was kind of interested in the experiences of people who'd come to Vietnam, who joined the military in Vietnam. Anyway, it's particularly interesting because I grew up in an army town. I grew up in Aldershot in England, which is a garrison town. And this big sign as you come into town saying home of the British Army. It's very much, when I grew up, it was very much dominated by soldiers, particularly soldiers from the airborne, from the parachute regiment. And that, it made a certain kind of town, a certain kind of masculine, vaguely intimidating place. And I kind of wondered what life was like for national servicemen who'd been brought into the army in the 1960s to go to Vietnam, people who'd never imagined this as a career or a part of their lives, suddenly ending up in the army, in a military society, in a war zone. And so my book, Macho's War, which I think, do I have a copy of? I brought some copies. There, it doesn't matter. It looks like a book, you know, it's made of paper and got a picture on the cover and stuff. You can probably imagine it. Yeah. Well, one of the few of my books actually won an award rather than get shortlisted. Well, I'm listening to his introduction, I'm thinking, yeah, what he's basically saying is I never win anything. I'm always second.
Mark, do you take questions as you talk?
Yeah, you can. You tell me sharp.
Just a quick one.
No, please.
When you did those radio interviews, it
Yeah.
seems that people are hypersensitive around some of those topics that you were talking about. Were there a lot of callers? Was there a lot of edginess?
It wasn't open,
Oh,
so it wasn't live.
okay.
So we produced 6 episodes in the studio. I have spoken though quite recently when this Myths of War book came out. I was on Nightline and I got quite a lot of calls, some of which were quite difficult to understand what point people were trying to make. But most people seem to be, rather than argue with you, they have a contribution to make, which isn't, as I say, always quite clear what it might be. With Nightline, when I'm talking about the book, people were ringing in and saying that they had heard that the reason Australian troops ostensibly landed in the wrong place in Gallipoli was that a Turkish diver had got under and moved all the markers. And this apparently is something that is told in Turkey. When, you know, they say, got you there, didn't we? And part of my book, I do a tour in Turkey with a guide in Gallipoli. And they do have, again, I don't know why I didn't realise, but Turkish people have their own series of myths about Gallipoli, including they believe that the British commander of the British destroyers was put to death by the Queen or something for his failure at Gallipoli. And
I think it's uninterrupted your
no, I don't care. As long as I can hear my own voice, I'm happy with the moment. I don't care what I'm talking about.
You might have speaking later. So you're saying that all the time?
Yeah, if I want to always rings up. Do my son tell me to shut up. My son's birthday today. There you go, I'll pass it on. He's 20, which brings us to the next point. So after these 6 episodes ran, my son, who was at school at the time, said to me, is it true that Australia fought a war against emus? Like, no, it's a load of rubbish. Like, I don't know, you know, like you always do if you don't know anything about something. Yeah, no, rubbish. I know it is real. And of course it was. I then realised I did some research, and in 1934 there was something that even at the time was called the Emu War. So thank you to my boy who is 20 now. This here is a picture from the Emu War. Australia is the only nation in the world ever to have made war on its own national symbol. When the rabbit, so 2 things happened. One, they put in the rabbit-proof fence in WA, and 2, at the end of the First World War, soldier settlers and other settlers come from Perth, I suppose, come from the cities of the West and settle outside in small farms. Their settlements expand north, and eventually they meet migrating emus who are kind of funneled down by the new rabbit-proof fence. Emus see a bunch of crops, corn, whatever, wheat, and think, oh, that'd be good for stomping on, because that's what emus do. So they eat some of it, and then they go around stomping on it. So this is considered an act of war by some of the settlers, and they go to the government and say, can we have some machine guns, get rid of the emus? The government goes, no, we don't just give people machine guns. But we'll send you the gun party. So the government sends in a guy called Major Meredith, a gunnery sergeant and another man, down to Meredith, oddly enough, in WA, to meet the emu, to meet and repel the emu menace. No one had ever, as far as I knew, gone back to the battlegrounds of the Emu Wars, since they only involved like 3 people and a bunch of emus. So I said to Claire, my partner, that we should go on holiday there. And quite often, I've got to say, my holiday suggestions are rebuffed. I mean, do you remember? There was the time, it was her birthday and we were in Europe, and she didn't want to go to Auschwitz. Can you imagine? The perfect opportunity. So yeah, I always want to go to jails or concentration camps or battlefields. She wants to go to nice restaurants. What a load of nonsense. Anyway, I convinced her, and we went on holiday to Perth. We stayed in an old warder's cottage from the jail, which was excellent. And I went to the jail. No, I actually didn't get to the jail, did I? No. And then we drove out to the site of the Emu Wars.
Sorry, Mark, where is this site? You're not talking, it's well north of Perth.
Meredith. So it's a little bit north and
West.
East.
So,
Was around Camden in England, right?
Campion, yeah. So they're pretty much deserted townships now, they're ghost towns. I think Meredith, Campion was a siding, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's only about 3 hours west of Perth. It's not that far. There's nothing there.
See? Perfect holiday place. That's what people want, isn't it? Nothing, peace. Beautiful countryside. And then there's a rabbit-proof fence. And we thought the rabbit-proof fence might be a thing. It's just like this collapsed bit of fence. It's about yay high, isn't it? With some holes in it. I'm going, look, it's great. The place going, yeah. Why are we here? So, the idea was they thought that they could repel the Emu advance with a machine gun. But unfortunately, if you've got to use a machine gun, what you need is for your, which is just a single gun, you need your enemy to advance like Zulus on block and not actually understand that if they keep coming forward in a row, they're going to be machine gun. Emus don't do that. If you fire on emus, they all go off in different directions, so it's useless pretty much having a machine gun. Also, emus can carry a surprisingly large number of bullets. You can hit them, who knew? But emus have quite small heads, so it's quite hard to hit them on the head. If you shoot them a bunch of times, they can still run off. This led to Major Meredith attributing military prowess and indeed eventually even military organisation to the emus. He wrote back after action reports saying that the emus were as formidable a foe as the Zulu. And he began to discern unit level organisation among his emu opponents.
Oh, they're smoking at you.
They're just losing. They can't figure out why humans weren't beating emus. So they reckon the emus had observers who would forewarn the rest of the flock. So I was looking into this and thinking how, even at the time people thought it was funny. Like the newspapers were just really shredding it, saying another victory to emus in the Emu Wars. And they thought it was going to be a propaganda victory to the minister, Pierce, who had sent the gun party. So they allowed a movie-tone camera crew to follow it, and they just came up. Oh no. Emus again. Emus win again. So yeah, what we were doing, I was trying to understand the terrain and therefore the tactics deployed by the enemy, and see if there was any remnant of the Emu Wars to look at, really. And Claire was growing a little bit impatient when we weren't finding anything, apart from this really rubbish bit of fence. And then suddenly we get to Campion, and there's this sign. It was like a sign from God, except it was a road sign. And it's like this big with a picture of an emu on the other side, and it says, Emu Wars 1934, was it? And I thought, how did that possibly get there? So we went back to Campion, and I went to the library and said, you know who put up this sign? And they said, could have been Buckinghamshire Council. So I rang now, I forget the order in which it happened, it's in the book, but I rang Buckinghamshire Council. They said, oh, it could be those blokes in Champion, wherever. And they said, no, it's not us, but our CEO saw it the other day and they wondered who put it up. So these three different shire councils, I think Muriel, one of the shire councils, eventually promised we should get to the bottom of it, and she gave me a phone number. After about a few hours of it, Muriel sent me a phone number of this guy called Ralph English, something like that. And I rang around finished and I said, I'm just trying to work out who put up this sign. He said, I did. And I said, why? But what was interesting, nobody at any of these shire councils thought there was anything strange about a private citizen putting up a huge memorial sign by the side of the road in Western Australia. And he put it up because there were, he said, and I believe him too, because I did it, suddenly tourists coming through wanting to see where the Emu Wars had happened, and he wanted to give them something to look at. So in the newspaper, I nominated him for Australian of the Year, but nothing came of it, as so often with my projects. What did we find out about that? So then I was I wanted to understand how the story had come about, how the myth had arisen that the emus were an organised fighting force. And I went to the service record of Meredith, the guy who had run the gunpowder, Major General. And he was a professional soldier, and he'd been in the army through the First World War, and he'd never managed to get out of Australia. Like he'd ended up, furthest he got was Thursday Island, where at the time they used to train troops. So really, the emus were his first real enemy. The emus were, the First World War wasn't a war for him. Didn't he get, I think the last weeks of the war, he got sent to England and then invalided out. But that might have been the Second World War, because something very similar happened to him in the Second World War. So the only war that he ever got to see as a military man, as a soldier, was the Emu War. So to talk up his enemy actually talks up his own military prowess. He actually, I found out, went to the Korean War as well. And this was someone who was in the army before the First World War. He went to the Korean War as a civilian, still determined to have a war. And he got some kind of American medals for his service as a civilian in Korea, which he wasn't allowed to wear on Anzac Day. That was the final straw for him. So I'm not worried about anything to do with this anymore. He done his very, very best to be a war hero, and it only really worked against emus. The other strange thing I found out with the Emu War story, and I suspect this is going to come as news perhaps to everyone in this room, but there is a field of study about gay animals. Does everyone know that?
Yeah.
Gay animals. Somebody who, a leading academic in the field of gay animals, believes that the emus were conscious of being at war with humans. And in fact, I've always been at war with humans, and conscious of that fact. They also believe that, it's apparently true, people observed gay emus having sex with each other before straight emus having sex with each other. I think this is what you need to be talking about this morning, isn't it? And what the whole point is, what this woman pointed out, the men, so Meredith had assumed that the emu lookout was a male straight emu, whereas in fact, for reasons I know, of course I can't remember now, it was quite clear there was a female emu. So there is a movement to bring emu self-organisation and indeed emu gender to the forefront of the idea of the Emu War, and I'd like to think I've done my little bit to contribute to that.
They're the original cockatoos.
I didn't say it, mate. I did not say it.
Excuse me, who won the war?
Well, it's obviously there's an emu view on that, which I'm not really qualified to comment upon, but there are still a very large number of emus. But then again, it wasn't supposed to be a genocidal conflict. As we drove away from the sign, back through Campion, Claire pointed to a distant hill, and what was on that distant hill? Emu lookouts. Emus. Returning to the battlefield, perhaps on a Kokoda-style pilgrimage to a place where their ancestors had died, or perhaps simply laying claim to land that was still theirs. But I was really pleased to see some emus. They think that So Meredith did give a casualty report. What was his casualties? I think something went wrong with the brakes on one of his vehicles. But yeah, so according to Major Meredith, Emus did sustain far more casualties than his party of 3 human beings, all of whom went home unwounded rather. But people questioned even at the time. I think Meredith claimed 20,000 or something, but people questioned his methodology even at the time. Like it seemed that if emus went to the bushes, he argued that they'd gone to the bushes to die, whereas in fact they just run off because someone was making a lot of noise. But you know, emus don't have an independent state. It's hard to understand what the emu's war aims were, to be honest. Being as they don't speak and previously were unknown for military organisation. But I think the fact that they'd survived one chicken probably does speak to a certain fortitude in new military thinking. At the time, some people have said the reason that my son knew about the Emu War was there's a particularly popular YouTube video which tells the story in cartoon form, and that believes the guy who made that says the emus won, which is why kids love it. So the book I wanted to write was all about the Emu Wars, really, but my publisher didn't know there was a book in there. So he suggested I use stuff from the ABC show and talk about various other myths of Australian military history, which is what I did. Are there any more questions? Because I've just about run out of them.
Yes, the bridge now that they deconstruct, did it follow the design of the original bridge that was built?
No.
No.
No. It's another kind of bridge.
Right.
So was the picture at the top was the one that they used in Sri Lanka for the film. Did it look like the...
No, it didn't look much like that, actually. That's the way I remember it.
So the film was shot in Sri Lanka.
The film was
Yeah,
shot in
it's
Sri
all
Lanka,
in
yeah.
Sri Lanka. But people forget, actually, that the film was quite controversial at the time, as was King Rat. Like the idea, there's a lot of talk of collaborationism, essentially. You know, the film is about a British officer who collaborates with the Japanese to an extent to build this bridge. So it was really controversial. King Rat and the other, I guess, particularly famous book and film about the prisoners has the Australian prisoners exclusively as criminals. You know, they were the thieves running the rackets in the camp, so that was very controversial as well at the time. And yet, to some extent, these have become our memory of those events because they were such powerful dramas. The other thing I talk about, one of the other things I talk about in the book is Simpson and his donkey and that painting, which is not of Simpson, but I and everybody else believes it is. It's actually a painting of a New Zealander called Henderson and his donkey. And his donkey, Henderson's donkey, was called Murphy, as was Simpson's donkey. But I strongly suspect that every donkey was called Murphy as a kind of unkindness towards Irish people. And Simpson does also appear to have had 2 other donkeys, one of which was called Admiral. So yes, not every donkey. But there was more than one person picking up the wounded and a donkey, and just not only an Australian but a New Zealander. And one guy had devoted a large proportion of his life for some reason to demystifying the mystery of Simpson, to pointing out that it is actually impossible to carry a wounded man down a hill on a donkey without killing him. Like, you get a seriously injured person cannot be transported downwards by donkey through rough terrain. And he says that not only did Simpson not save hundreds of people, as he is sometimes given credit for, he in fact saved nobody's lives, but he still did a very brave thing in transporting people who most probably had their arm around the donkey rather than be spayed across the back of it or over down the hill. I went to Gallipoli and we had a look at Simpson's grave, and as I say, I got the sort of Turkish version of what happened, but I was very surprised. I was on a tour made up largely of Australian and New Zealanders in their 20s to 30s, and he asked if anyone had heard of Simpson, and nobody had. And I don't know if maybe they misheard it or what. And then when we got to the grave, he said, "Have anyone heard of his donkey?" Which seemed highly unlikely, we'd never heard of him. But it wasn't a story, for some reason, with that particular group. It wasn't a story that resonated, where I would have thought it was the story that people learned.
It was more of a Victoria Cross, wasn't it?
I'm not sure. Everyone knows more about Gallipoli than I do. So.
What is the road?
Sorry?
That's the actual bridge. That's it.
And the other one's the one from the river, is it?
Yeah, it's a steel light, sorry, I'll make that up. Yeah, the top one is still from the movie, and the bottom one, which I understand is the actual bridge.
So, when you say the actual bridge, do you mean the bridge?
The actual, the real bridge that is there now, which they call, which generates all
The tourist traffic
Tourists.
The bridge known as the bridge over.
bridge on the river now known as the River Kwai.
No, I don't mean to sound silly, but I mean it's just crazy, isn't it?
It is very silly indeed. Does anybody else have any questions or any more questions?
Why do you think people hold on to some of these myths?
They're nice stories. I think Simpson and his donkey is popular because it's got a donkey in it. Kids like donkeys. And he gives you a war hero who doesn't kill people. And if you go to the War Memorial now, the Australian War Memorial, there's pictures of Simpson, there's a statue rather of Simpson and his donkey, there's a statue of Weary Dunlop, there's a statue of Nurse Bullwinkle, and there's a statue of a guy being nice to a dog, an explosive dog. So it's a way of looking at war without talking about killing. Talking about war as if it was a mass exercise in saving lives rather than ending them. I think it's why that's held. Similarly, one of the myths about the Emu Wars, I think, is that it was a product of soldier settlers who had a military mentality, and that's why they wanted to machine gun the emus. I'm not sure there were many soldier settlers left in WA by the 30s, because soldier settlement was a failure. Most people failed on the land and just went back home. I think it was industrial militancy. I think it was people who were used to striking to get what they wanted in a way, who were used to organising labour. And because a lot of former miners and stuff are also settling. And it was that which gave them the militancy to tackle the emus head on. The prisoners, why those myths grew up? People didn't know how to handle the POWs when they came back from Japan. They weren't the returning war heroes of archetype that people are comfortable with. They'd surrendered and they were prisoners. But this isn't the digger that the larger than life natural fighting man that you've been led to believe an Australian would be. So rather than perhaps look at what their experiences really had been, a lot of which were very confronting. They, to some degree, a myth built up which has obvious political uses about mateship, and that the reason Australians survived better than other prisoners was they were all mates. No, they weren't, and no, they didn't. The Dutch survived better than the Australians, and the Dutch are, you know, held in contempt traditionally by Australian prisoners. I think the Australians may well have survived the worst, apart from the coolies, so-called. It had nothing to do with mateship. Like, everybody's got mates. Dutch people have mates, English people have mates, Americans have mates, coolies have mates. But if you stress that over what was the failures of Australian officers to a large extent to look after their men, that caused them not to survive as well as other races. Races is kind of the right word, because part of the reason the Dutch did well was they had a lot of Eurasian people who knew what plants you could eat and stuff, and even, I believe, bush medicine to an extent. So, I mean, part of the reason that those myths grow is that the real experiences of the men weren't interrogated in the way they might have been, and because political use has been put to of this idea of mateship and cross-class collaboration or whatever. Others, I think, they're just stories, just nice stories.
Mark, you see there's recurring themes, narratives around Vietnam, which is Nashos, and there's some sort of communication narrative that's convenient or popular, so it persists and people don't like it being changed.
I think with the Vietnam stuff, that's not what I wanted to write about when I wrote The Nashos War. What I wanted to write about, I say, was the experience of people who had never planned to be in the military, finding a place in military society. I wasn't really even interested in the fighting. I was interested in the sociology of it. Because when I showed the manuscript to Claire, and Claire said, well, the interesting bits of this are the battles, I hadn't realised. I moved more into writing about that. And I certainly wasn't interested in writing about myths, because I had written those myths myself, that Vietnam veterans were spat on, had blood poured on them, were met by demonstrators. Pretty much none of this ever occurred. The first Vietnam veteran to claim to have been spat upon was Sylvester Stallone, John Rambo in First Blood, the movie in 1981. The first time after the Vietnam War, which isn't to say no Vietnam veterans were spat upon, but nobody had ever said it until then, long after the war was over, in a dramatisation in America. After that, the stories suddenly flowered. There was similarly in Australia, in the US, in New Zealand, there was never a demonstration at an airport against returning men from Vietnam. All the stories are untrue, there's no reportage of it anywhere. It would be virtually impossible in most places. It's very difficult to stage a demonstration at an airport anyway, and back in the day it would have been harder. There was military police there when the blokes came back. They actually picked up their last pay when they came back. They're armed men. A bunch of demonstrators never came into the terminal at night. The first time that anything like this was ever recorded was the Jane Fonda movie Going Home. That had a bunch of hippies demonstrating outside an airport terminal saying 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your bloody war. And people absorb that into their historical memory in the same way that it was discovered that some Anzacs believe a particular scene in the Peter Weir movie Gallipoli happened to them, which is a scene where monocled British officers are mocked by men pretending to be riding donkeys or something, camel pretending to anyway. Sorry, I can't remember the exact scene, but that has become a part of the memory of the men who really were there. it seems that a collective memory does grow, which is fed upon, which feeds upon, obviously people sharing memories but also feeds upon media and other received accounts. That's all I have to say about that.
I mean, I'm interested in that particular, the Vietnam War one with the, was it 1988 with the Welcome Home parade or whatever in Sydney. Yet throughout, when units came back from the Vietnam War, they were often given
About 16 welcome home parades
throughout the
during the
country.
war itself, when battalions returned to their home cities. The idea that there had been no welcome home parades only came up after the reunion parade, the big reunion parade. There's this idea that, so when it was acceptable, but even at the time people were saying there hadn't been any, even when it was,
So that, I mean,
even
that
when
became a national,
they're in, so well within living memory.
yeah, and that became a national event. It was almost like the myth had created this upswell of feeling to create a long overdue welcome home parade.
It was initially just a reunion. Like it gained this idea of a long overdue welcome home parade when people why were we reading up if we honest? So I don't want to say something I know definitely isn't. I'm not certain is true. But what is certainly true is that the biggest welcome home parades during the Vietnam War itself, the battalions, were far larger, for single battalions were larger than the welcome home parade for everyone in the 80s. And they were also far, far larger than any demonstration against the war. We remember the Vietnam War as a time of protest. It's often remembered as a time of protest. But most people weren't protesters. Most people were in favour of the war. Most people are in favour of most wars most of the time, particularly when they start. People love them. So, in a way, sort of, prioritising dissenters in memory creates its own distorted memory.
Mark, the notion that they were rejected as well by the RSL and so on as being a big thing. Was it a big thing? Did it really happen?
There's no mention of this ever during the war itself, which again doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
They
doesn't
were
mean it
rejected
didn't
by the
happen.
RSL.
Were they?
They were.
Right.
No, they were rejected by the RSL.
Go on
No,
then. No, please.
they weren't accepted as members of the RSL until later on.
Until when, sorry?
Until later on. It was some years later that they were accepted as members of the RSL.
But there were members of the RSL who were Vietnam veterans throughout the Vietnam War. There were constant recruitment campaigns among Vietnam veterans to join the RSL. The RSL itself knew that it could not survive without new veterans, without young people joining it. The RSL was hugely in favour of the Vietnam War. They loved it. It was a war against communism. It was a war that they would have wanted to fight. They were pretty much the right of the veterans. I think possibly what occurred is people have had an argument about this. If you go through the papers of the RSL are in National Library in Canberra. I've been through hundreds and hundreds of them, as has the official historian. The official historian has found one possible incident of one person having been refused entry to one sub-branch. I think probably what happened was they were refused entry to clubs because they weren't members, while they confused clubs with the national organisation. But if you're no different, honestly,
Can I just make a remark? That was the sort of my understanding of how it was likely to be, noting exactly what you said, that they're rejected. And I'm fascinated by these myths and, what you just said, I'm it's true, I accept that fully. But also the evidence seemed to be very much overwhelmingly along the lines, RSL were very much in favour of that. They needed new members. We said it again with the Afghanistan thing.
It's the RSL's
The vets are saying, oh, we need new members and yada, yada, yada.
But which doesn't mean that every RSL branch welcomed every veteran at all. If you look at the RSLs now, dominated by Vietnam veterans, they're not the one in the Eastern Suburbs branch where James Brown, I think, runs it. They're not interested in having Afghanistan veterans there. It's a club for them in their mind, so James says. But that's not the same as arguing that the RSL was politically opposed to the Vietnam War, which is an absurd idea. Or that all veterans were barred from the RSL, because they just...
No, I didn't say they were all barred from the RSL.
No.
But some of the branches didn't welcome the Vietnam veterans.
That is certainly what some people say about some of the branches.
Yes.
But there was a large number of Vietnam veterans that were members of the RSL during the Vietnam War itself, and this is just forgotten. Again, I don't know why the RSL allowed that to be forgotten. The first time this idea gained massive popularity was when the RSL basically refused to collaborate, or did not collaborate to the extent that the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia was happy with during the Agent Orange troubles. So the RSL refused to acknowledge that Vietnam veterans had had a different experience of war because of chemicals than traditional RSL members have had. A public rift between organised Vietnam veterans and the rest of the RSL occurred, and at that point you begin to get this surge of narratives about veterans being turned away from RSLs. As I say, I can find, if you look at when veterans really were turned away, it's a huge story. Like in 1964 in Port Moresby, they wouldn't let black people, I forget what they call them, they call the New Guinea veterans. They wouldn't let them into the RSL in Moresby. It's a massive story. When they expelled communists from the RSL, it's a massive story. When they wouldn't let blacks in, indigenous people, into the RSL in Warwickshire, is that how you say the word? It's a huge national story. The RSL can't just turn people away. And I say, these stories did not exist back in the day.
I know it's not
but did Monash feature in any of your research in the first, Gallipoli?
Yeah, I did a little bit on Monash. Everyone knows, again, this thing, everyone knows more about than me, so I'm loath to say much. But the idea that a lot of historians have criticised the idea that Monash was an outsider who won the war, because he didn't win the war, obviously, although he was a brilliant general, and to some extent the outsider status has been slightly overplayed, which is not to say there wasn't, it wasn't odd that he should be a Prussian Jew. He's in charge of the Australian army in a war was largely a war against Germany. But anti-Semitism wasn't what it was in some European countries, in Australia back in the day, and obviously wasn't the huge obstacle to Monash's path that it could have been, as is evidenced by the fact that Monash reached the height that he did. But what I tried to show in the book about Monash, which nobody had said, was that it was not strange at all for Prussian Jews to be in the military. They made up 10%, I think, the actual figures in the book, 10% of students at the engineering academy, particularly in Prussia itself. If anything, Monash wasn't an outsider in a Prussian Jew, in the sense that Prussian Jews were outsiders to the military. He was more an exemplar of a tradition that had grown up in Prussia, in Germany, of Jews being military engineers. That's kind of what I've read about.
Yeah, I believe Ludendorff was came from the same region as the Monash family in Prussia.
Right.
And they were an age, very similar age.
But yeah, but loads of people know more about it, as I say, Monash. I was going to write, there was a point where Monash said he'd met Ned Kelly, and I was going to write a bit about that, but he didn't seem worth it.
No, I don't think it was the age. I don't remember that. He just, I think the comments were, he wished he had Ned Kelly with him.
He actually said, he did an after dinner speech where he said, I think he may have even said he watered the horse. So he was certainly prone to exaggeration,
Yeah.
but he was still doesn't mean he wasn't a great general.
The evidence that the Korean War was the forgotten war, is that, does the evidence sort of support that? Is that a myth? Because we sort of all think about the Korea, that's a forgotten war. So the forgotten veterans
They certainly, the Korean veterans never really had a public voice. They were like K-Force, which was part of the Korean force, was a bunch of Second World War men who basically wanted to fight again. So I guess they were already integrated in what the Korean service was only part of their service as veterans. If you look at the Korean War in popular memory, there's been a movie made about the Emu Wars, which is out at the moment. There's a second one starring John Cleese, supposedly in production. That's two more than there are about the Korean War, about Australia in the Korean War. So clearly, it never really captured the public imagination. There's very little protest. Even among communists, there's a sense that these were Maoists, and the largest strain of the Australian Communist Party were Stalinists, so they were kind of opposed themselves. They had the Welcome Home Parade, but very little public presence. But still not as forgotten as the Malayan emergency, the fellas who fought there. The fact that national servicemen fought and national servicemen died in Malaya during the emergency was forgotten. So when I'm staying out to the detail, there's certainly a few there. I suspect, I've got a book to review for the Australian now that I think talks about reviving memories of the Malayan emergency, so-called. I think that's going to become a bit more of a thing in coming years. People realise what really happened there. Konfrontasi, our kind of covert war with Indonesia. Who knows about that? So yeah, there's a few forgotten conflicts. A few largely unremembered conflicts between them.
What I find, Mark, is the concept of the Second World War was often described as the last good war. Black hats, white hats. And then after that, Korea was a police action, noted as a United Nations police action. The Malaysian emergency, Konfrontasi, where you get a lot of, it's not clear who were the good guys, who were the bad guys. Australians were thrown in there with Nashos in all the ones. Vietnam was the first confrontation that Australia committed to without English. So I think there's a whole lot of things that go on that make people, whether they remember them, whether they're forgotten. World War II is, we all know about a lot of things about World War II and the concepts. Western democracies fighting fascism.
Yeah, it's an easy sell, for sure.
It's an easy sell, and then when we get into other, you know, Korea, and all the ones after that. They're murky. People have got more information, whether it's right or wrong, and you get a conflict of opinions about.
And you've also got far fewer people were involved, far fewer Australians
Small
were involved in those wars, and often they were under Australian command, Simpson in Korea. And I think, I don't think there would have been that same degree of controversy, like the same degree of controversy about the Vietnam War in Australia if it hadn't been for national servicemen. I mean, it was for the national service scheme, and people who had come out of the Second World War believed that professional soldiers went to war, put themselves in mortal danger. Wasn't a strange concept to them. Wasn't that strange a thing that professional soldiers and former professional soldiers should be fighting in Korea. Whereas the idea of taking young men off the street and sending them to Vietnam, or as was initially envisaged, sending them to New Guinea, was something newer, something more confronting. Any more questions? Yes. How many Emus all told? I don't know if anyone has committed to a comprehensive audit of the Emu population. And obviously their case was further north, so it was only sort of advanced party that came down south. So I don't know, I couldn't.
Did they keep a record of how many actually?
Well, like I say, they claimed about 20,000, but that included Indians who had gone off into the bush. So actual carcasses in the network. So they don't need very many. There was one, they ran over one in the Jeep, but he messed up the Jeep. But afterwards, I think he had another go at it later on. And then there was a war on Brumbies as well. So there was, what's that, wildlife in large numbers.
They're still having a war on roads. Yeah, because
It's a forever war.
Cosmos National Park.
Yeah. But no, I can't speak to Emu population numbers. Any more questions?
Thank you very much. In fact, people, we have a few copies at a very reduced price of Mark's book over there, if you are interested. And we do have one final thing. We do have a Lucky Door prize, which includes a copy of Mark's book as well as
Unlucky Door.
as well as another copy from Simon & Schuster, Mark's publisher, and some and a tote bag from. First of all, thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you very much.
The lucky.
All right, I couldn't figure out what this was.
Yeah.
It was tea bag.
No.
That's nice, a loose tea bag. E44.
Who's got E44?
44.
You better draw it again.
Is it you?
Take it. No anymore. You sure?
Okay.
Fix.
I was just thinking I hope she's
E45. Oh, you done 46, is it?
46.
46.
E46.
Has to be someone.
Has to be someone here.
It's not ours.
Probably me.
I know the beginning.